The old clock shop stood at the very end of a narrow cobblestone street that was lined with buildings made of gray brick that had been weathered by decades of wind and rain, turning them into a uniform shade of slate that absorbed the light rather than reflecting it, which made the entire street feel like a tunnel of calm shadows, even in the middle of the day. The shop itself was a quiet sanctuary, a place where the outside world, with its rushing cars and busy people, seemed to fade away completely, leaving only the steady and rhythmic sound of 1,000 mechanical hearts beating in unsynchronized unison. Upon pushing open the heavy wooden door, which swung inward on brass hinges that had been oiled to a silent perfection, one was immediately enveloped in an atmosphere that smelled of cedar wood and old paper and the faint metallic tang of brass polish and clock oil, a scent that was dry and dusty and incredibly comforting. The air inside was still and cool, hanging motionless in the space between the floor and the high tin ceiling, which was painted a creamy white that had yellowed with age to the color of old parchment. The walls were lined from floor to ceiling with shelves made of dark oak wood, the grain of the timber visible through the layers of varnish that had darkened over time to a deep, rich brown. On these shelves sat the clocks, rows upon rows of them, standing like silent sentinels guarding the passage of time. There were mantel clocks made of black marble with gold lettering on their faces, and carriage clocks with glass sides that revealed the intricate brass gears moving slowly inside, and cuckoo clocks from the Black Forest carved with leaves and birds that remained silent in their wooden houses. The light in the shop came from a large bay window at the front, which was filled with a display of pocket watches hanging on small hooks, their silver and gold cases gleaming softly in the diffused light that filtered through the glass, which was slightly wavy with age, distorting the view of the street outside into a blur of gray and green. The sun was hidden behind a layer of thick clouds, creating a flat and featureless illumination that cast no sharp shadows, but bathed the entire shop in a soft and sleepy twilight. In the center of the room stood the grandfather clocks, tall and majestic, their wooden cases towering over the other timepieces, their pendulums swinging back and forth with a slow and hypnotic rhythm that seemed to slow down the beating of one's own heart. Tick, tock, tick, tock. The sound was not loud, but it was pervasive, filling every corner of the room with a texture of sound that was as physical as the dust motes that danced in the air. The dust motes were visible in the few shafts of light that managed to penetrate the deeper recesses of the shop, swirling in slow, lazy circles, rising and falling on invisible currents of air that were created by the movement of the pendulums. At the very back of the shop, behind a long glass counter filled with watch chains and winding keys, sat the clockmaker, a man who seemed as old and as timeless as the objects he tended. He sat on a high wooden stool with a leather seat that had been polished smooth by years of use, his back hunched over a workbench that was littered with tiny tools and disassembled mechanisms. He wore a magnifying loupe over one eye, a black plastic cylinder that gave him the appearance of a cyclops staring intently at the microscopic world of gears and springs. His hands were steady and pale, moving with a glacial slowness that was mesmerizing to watch. He was working on the movement of a small French clock, a delicate assembly of brass wheels and steel pinions that lay spread out on a piece of white velvet cloth. He picked up a pair of fine tweezers, the metal tips meeting with precision, and reached for a tiny screw that was no bigger than a grain of sand. He lifted the screw slowly, holding it in the air for a moment to ensure his grip was secure, before lowering it gently into a threaded hole in the brass plate. He turned the tweezers with a subtle twist of his fingers, threading the screw into place, one rotation at a time. Turn, turn, turn. The friction of the metal was silent, but felt through the tool. He picked up a small screwdriver, its handle made of bone, and tightened the screw a fraction of a millimeter, feeling the resistance increase until it was seated perfectly. There was no rush in his movements, no sense of urgency. The clock had been broken for years, and another hour or another day would make no difference to its mechanical soul. The clockmaker paused to wipe his brow with a handkerchief that he pulled from the pocket of his gray dust coat, a slow, deliberate motion that allowed him to rest his eyes for a moment. He looked up at the wall of clocks, watching the second hand sweep around the dials in jerky movements, each one marking a different second, each one telling a slightly different story of the time. The sound of the ticking was a chaotic layering of rhythms, some clocks ticking fast and high-pitched, others ticking slow and deep, creating a white noise that washed over the mind and smoothed out the thoughts. Tick, tick-tock, tick-tock, tick-tock. It was a river of sound that flowed endlessly. The clockmaker returned to his work, picking up a small oiler, a glass pen with a fine metal tip filled with a golden lubricant. He touched the tip of the oiler to the pivot point of a gear, watching as a tiny drop of oil transferred from the metal to the jeweled bearing. The oil spread out in a perfect circle, drawn by capillary action, coating the surfaces that would rub together, reducing the friction, easing the movement. He did this for every pivot point on the plate, moving from one to the next with a methodical patience. Dip, touch, wait. Dip, touch, wait. The repetition was soothing, a ritual of maintenance that ensured the longevity of the machine. The smell of the oil was sharp and clean, mixing with the dusty smell of the shop. Outside the window, the rain began to fall again, a gentle drizzle that misted the glass and blurred the view even further. The sound of the rain was faint, a gentle hiss that underlined the ticking of the clocks. The shop felt even more isolated now, a capsule of warmth and dryness floating in a wet world. The clockmaker picked up the mainspring, a coil of blue steel that contained the potential energy of the clock. He examined it for cracks, running his thumb along the smooth metal, feeling for imperfections. It was sound. He began to wind the spring into its barrel, turning the arbor with a key, listening to the clicks of the ratchet as the spring tightened, storing power coil by coil. Click, click, click. The tension grew in his hand, a physical resistance that represented the time that the clock would keep. He placed the barrel back into the movement, fitting the teeth of the great wheel into the pinion of the center wheel. The gears meshed perfectly, a marriage of mathematics and metal. He placed the top plate over the assembly, lining up the pivot holes with the tops of the arbors. This was a delicate operation, requiring a gentle touch and infinite patience. He nudged one gear, then another, guiding them into their homes until the plate slipped down with a soft metallic clink. He secured the plate with screws, tightening them in a star pattern to ensure even pressure. The heart of the clock was reassembled. He attached the pendulum, a brass disc on a steel rod, and gave it a gentle push. It swung to the left, then to the right. Tick, tock, tick, tock. The escapement caught and released, the gears turning, the energy of the spring into the measurement of time. The clock was alive again. The clockmaker watched it beat, counting the swings, checking the symmetry of the motion. He adjusted a small nut at the bottom of the pendulum, raising the bob slightly to speed up the beat. He listened again. It was steady. It was true. He sat back on his stool and let out a long, slow breath, a sigh of satisfaction that mingled with the quiet air.
He looked around the shop again, letting his eyes wander over the faces of the clocks. Some were made of porcelain with hand-painted flowers. Others were made of brushed steel with stark modern numerals. There were clocks with moon phases, showing the waxing and waning of the lunar cycle, and clocks with calendars, showing the day and the month. All of them ticking, all of them waiting. The afternoon wore on, the light in the shop growing dimmer as the sun sank lower behind the clouds. The shadows lengthened, stretching out from the base of the grandfather clocks, creeping across the floorboards. The clockmaker did not turn on a lamp, preferring to work in the fading natural light, which was softer on his eyes. He picked up a polishing cloth, a square of yellow chamois leather, and began to wipe the case of the clock he had just repaired. He rubbed the wood in slow, circular motions, bringing out the luster of the mahogany, removing the fingerprints and the dust. Rub, rub, rub.
He listened again. It was steady. It was true. He sat back on his stool and let out a long, slow breath, a sigh of satisfaction that mingled with the quiet air. He looked around the shop again, letting his eyes wander over the faces of the clocks. Some were made of porcelain with hand-painted flowers. Others were made of brushed steel with stark modern numerals. There were clocks with moon phases, showing the waxing and waning of the lunar cycle, and clocks with calendars, showing the day and the month, all of them ticking, all of them waiting. The afternoon wore on, the light in the shop growing dimmer as the sun sank lower behind the clouds. The shadows lengthened, stretching out from the base of the grandfather clocks, creeping across the floorboards. The clockmaker did not turn on a lamp, preferring to work in the fading natural light, which was softer on his eyes. He picked up a polishing cloth, a square of yellow chamois leather, and began to wipe the case of the clock he had just repaired. He rubbed the wood in slow, circular motions, bringing out the luster of the mahogany, removing the fingerprints and the dust. Rub, rub, rub. The sound of the cloth on the wood was a soft whisper. He polished the glass door, cleaning it until it was invisible. He polished the brass bezel until it shone like gold in the twilight. The work was meditative, a way of honoring the craftsmanship of the past. He placed the clock on a shelf next to a stack of leather-bound books, aligning it perfectly with the edge. He stood there for a moment, just looking at it, listening to its new voice, joining the chorus of the shop. It was a good sound, a healthy sound. The rain outside had settled into a steady rhythm, a drumming on the tin roof that sounded like distant applause. The shop was a world within a world, a place where time was both the subject and the master. The clockmaker walked slowly to the front of the shop, his shoes making a soft scuffing sound on the floor. He looked out at the street, which was now dark and empty, the street lamps casting pools of yellow reflection on the wet stones. He reached up and turned the sign in the window from open to closed. The day was done, but the clocks continued. They would continue through the night, marking the seconds while the city slept. Tick-tock, tick-tock. The rhythm was eternal. The clockmaker walked back to his bench and began to tidy up his tools, placing the tweezers in their box, the screwdrivers in their rack, the oiler in its stand. Everything had a place. Everything was in order. He brushed the filings from the velvet cloth into a small bin. He covered the movement of the next clock he would work on with a glass bell jar, protecting it from the dust. He took off his loop and placed it in his pocket. He took off his dust coat and hung it on a hook by the door. He stood in the center of the shop one last time, closing his eyes and just listening. The sound was a wave, a vibration that entered the body and slowed the pulse. It was the sound of peace, the sound of order, the sound
of sleep. He walked to the back door, which led to his living quarters, and opened it, the smell of cooking soup wafting in to meet the smell of the oil. He stepped through and closed the door behind him, leaving the clocks to their vigil. The shop was alone now, save for the time. The grandfather clocks swung their heavy pendulums. The wall clocks moved their hands. The cuckoo birds waited in their houses. And the dust motes settled slowly onto the floor in the dark. Beyond the heavy oak door that separated the showroom from the private recesses of the building lay a corridor that was narrower and dimmer than the shop itself, a passage that smelled less of oil and polish and more of dry timber and the accumulated dust of a century of quiet existence. The floorboards here were unvarnished pine, rougher under the soles of the shoes, and they creaked with a lower pitch, a groan of wood rubbing against wood that echoed softly in the confined space. To the left of the corridor was a door that was almost invisible in the shadows, its surface painted the same dull gray as the walls, a door that led to the storeroom, the heart of the shop's history. Turning the handle required a firm grip, the brass knob cold and tarnished, slipping slightly in the hand before the latch clicked open with a sound like a dry twig snapping. Pushing the door open revealed a room that was steeped in a silence so deep it felt heavy, a silence that pressed against the ears like water. This was the place where the clocks that could not be fixed came to rest, the place of spare parts and forgotten mechanisms. The room was long and narrow, lit only by a small high window at the far end that was covered in a layer of grime so thick it turned the moonlight outside into a faint milky glow that barely reached the floor. The air here was dry and still, hanging motionless over the shelves that lined every wall, shelves that were packed floor to ceiling with wooden crates and cardboard boxes and loose piles of metal parts. The smell was distinct, a mixture of oxidizing brass and crumbling paper and the sweet decay of old wood, a scent that was evocative of attics and basements and places where time had stopped. The clockmaker stepped inside and stood for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the gloom. He did not turn on the single naked bulb that hung from the center of the ceiling, preferring the soft ambiguity of the shadows. He walked slowly down the center aisle, his movement stirring the air just enough to cause the dust motes to swirl in the faint beam of light from the window. He reached out and touched the edge of a wooden crate, a rough box made of slats that was filled with old clock faces. He ran his finger along the rim, feeling the splinters and the dryness of the wood. Inside the crate, the faces were stacked like dinner plates, some made of white enamel with black numerals, others were made of painted metal with scenes of windmills and ships. Some were cracked with spider webs of hairline fractures through the glaze. Others were chipped at the edges, revealing the copper beneath. They were faces without hands, faces that could no longer tell the time, faces that stared out blindly into the dark. Next to the crate of faces was a box filled with mainsprings, coils of steel that were rusted together into a solid mass of orange and brown. They looked like fossilized snakes, ancient and dormant, their potential energy long since dissipated into the air. The clockmaker picked up a loose spring, weighing it in his hand, feeling the texture of the rust against his skin. It was rough and flaky, leaving a fine powder on his fingertips. He placed it back in the box, the metal making a dull clinking sound as it settled. He moved further into the room, past shelves that held jars of screws and washers, jars that once held jam or pickles, now repurposed to hold the tiniest components of the trade. The glass of the jars was cloudy with age, and the lids were rusted shut,
sealing the contents in a time capsule of their own. There were rows of pendulums hanging from hooks on the wall, brass discs and wooden rods and lead weights. They hung perfectly still, suspended in the vacuum of the room. A spider had spun a web between two of the pendulums, a delicate structure of silk that caught the faint light. The clockmaker admired the web, noting its symmetry and its fragility. It was a different kind of engineering, a biological machine built for trapping flies, but now it just trapped dust. The spider was nowhere to be seen, perhaps sleeping in a corner, or perhaps long gone, leaving its home to the silence. The floor of the storeroom was cluttered with larger objects that did not fit on the shelves. There were carcasses of grandfather clocks, tall wooden cases that had been stripped of their movements, standing like hollow trees in a petrified forest. Some were made of oak, others of mahogany or walnut, their surfaces scratched and scarred by the passage of years. One case had a door that hung open on a single hinge, revealing the empty darkness inside. The clockmaker ran his hand down the side of the case, feeling the fluting of the wood, the carved leaves and vines that decorated the hood. It was a masterpiece of carpentry, a shell that had once housed a beating heart. Now it was just wood, waiting for a purpose that might never come. In the corner of the storeroom, there was a workbench that was even more cluttered than the one in the shop. It was covered in a layer of dust that was gray and soft, like a blanket of felt. Under the dust were tools that had not been used in decades, rusted pliers and blunt files, and hammers with loose heads. There were sketches of...
The clockmaker picked up one of the papers, blowing the dust away gently. A cloud of gray particles rose into the air, swirling and dancing before settling back down. The drawing showed a complex escapement, a design that perhaps had never been built. He studied the lines, tracing the geometry of the gears with his eyes, appreciating the mind that had conceived it. He placed the paper back on the bench, smoothing it flat with his hand. The silence of the storeroom was not empty, but full of the presence of these objects. Each gear, each spring, each screw had a history, a manufacturer, a purpose. They had all been part of machines that measured the seconds and the hours, machines that had sat on mantels and hung on walls and houses where people lived and died. Now they were here, in this quiet purgatory, waiting. The clockmaker felt a sense of peace in this room, a connection to the continuity of his craft. He was the caretaker of these remnants, the guardian of the past. He walked to the window at the end of the room and looked out. The glass was so dirty that he could barely see the brick wall of the building next door, just a few feet away. But he could see the rain falling in the narrow alleyway between the buildings, drops of water that flashed briefly in the light of a distant street lamp before disappearing into the shadows. The rain was a constant companion, a rhythm that underscored the silence. He turned back to the room, looking at the shelves of boxes. There was a box on a high shelf that he hadn't looked at in years. He reached up and pulled it down, the cardboard feeling soft and damp in his hands. He placed it on the floor and opened the flaps. Inside, wrapped in old newspaper, were bells, brass bells of all sizes, bells that had once chimed the hour in carriage clocks and bracket clocks. He unwrapped one, a small domed bell with a clear tone. He held it by its mounting screw and tapped it gently with his fingernail. Ting! The sound was pure and high, a silver note that pierced the dusty air. Ting! It rang out clearly and then faded away slowly, the vibration lingering in the metal for seconds afterwards. He unwrapped another bell, a larger one with a deeper tone. Dong! The sound was mournful and rich. He sat on the floor, surrounded by the bells, unwrapping them one by one, tapping them, listening to their voices. It was a private concert, a symphony of brass and bronze, played for an audience of one.
The newspaper wrapping was dated from 50 years ago, the headlines speaking of events that were now history. He read a few lines about a treaty, about an election, about the price of wheat. The words were like the clocks, remnants of a time that was gone. He wrapped the bells up again, carefully, folding the old paper around the metal, placing them back in the box. He closed the flaps and lifted the box back onto the shelf, pushing it into its place among the dust. The effort of moving the box made him realize how tired he was. The day had been long, and the rhythm of the rain was lulling him into a state of drowsiness. He stood up and brushed the dust from his trousers. He looked around the room one last time, memorizing the placement of the shadows, the angle of the light, the stillness of the pendulums. It was a good room, a quiet room. He walked back towards the door, his footsteps soft on the pine boards. He stepped out into the corridor and closed the door behind him, turning the handle until the latch clicked shut, sealing the silence back inside. The corridor felt brighter in comparison, though it was still dim. He walked towards the back of the building, towards the small kitchen and the bedroom that lay beyond. The air grew warmer as he approached the living quarters, the smell of the soup stronger now, mixing with the smell of the wood stove. He entered the kitchen, a small room with a checkered floor and a white enamel stove. A pot was simmering on the burner, the lid rattling gently as the steam escaped. The sound was domestic and comforting, a contrast to the mechanical silence of the shop and the dusty silence of the storeroom. He lifted the lid and stirred the soup, a thick vegetable broth that smelled of carrots and onions. He ladled a bowl and sat at the small wooden table in the corner. He ate slowly, savoring the warmth of the food, the spoon clinking softly against the bowl. The window in the kitchen looked out onto a small courtyard where the rain was falling on the paving stones. He watched the water pool and run, reflecting the light from the kitchen window. After he had finished eating, he washed the bowl and the spoon in the sink, the water running warm over his hands. He dried them with a towel and hung it on a rack. He turned off the stove and the kitchen light, leaving the room in darkness. He walked into his bedroom, a simple room with a narrow bed and a chest of drawers. He undressed slowly, folding his clothes and placing them on a chair. He put on his nightshirt, which was made of soft flannel. He climbed into bed, the springs creaking under his weight. He pulled the blankets up to his chin, feeling the heaviness of the wool. The room was cool, but the bed was warm. He lay on his back and listened. He could hear the rain on the roof, a steady drumming that was louder here than in the shop. He could hear the wind sighing in the chimney. And, if he listened very closely, he could hear the faint rhythmic vibration of the hundreds of clocks in the shop, ticking in the distance. Tick-tock, tick-tock. It was a sound that was part of his blood, part of his soul. It was the heartbeat of the house. He closed his eyes, letting the darkness wash over him. The image of the storeroom came back to his mind, the dust, the boxes, the silent bells. He imagined the dust settling even more, adding another microscopic layer to the history of the room. He imagined the spider in its web waiting. He imagined the pendulums hanging still. The thoughts were slow and heavy, drifting like the clouds outside. His breathing deepened, slowing down to match the rhythm of the imaginary clocks. Inhale, tick. Exhale, tock. The boundary between the room and his mind began to blur. The sound of the rain became the sound of a vast ocean of time washing over the world. He was floating on that ocean, drifting towards the shores of sleep. The day was done. The work was finished. The clocks were winding down. The world was turning. And in the heart of the old clock shop, in the heart of the quiet street, in the heart of the rainy night, the clockmaker slept, his dreams filled with gears and springs and the endless, beautiful, boring passage of time.
The narrow staircase that led to the attic was hidden behind a door in the hallway that was painted the same peeling cream color as the walls, making it almost invisible to anyone who did not know it was there. But the clockmaker knew every inch of the building, and his hand found the porcelain knob in the dark without hesitation. Turning the catch, which had not been oiled in years, created a sharp squeak that echoed in the quiet corridor before the door swung inward, revealing a set of steep wooden steps that disappeared upwards into a gloom that smelled of dry pine resin and trapped heat. The air in the stairwell was different from the air in the shop or the bedroom. It was stagnant and thick, carrying the scent of dust that had been undisturbed for decades, a smell that was like a physical weight in the lungs. He began to climb the stairs, his footsteps heavy on the unpolished wood, each step groaning in protest under his weight, an ascending scale of creaks that marked his progress towards the roof. The handrail was a simple length of pipe that was cold to the touch and coated in a fine layer of grit that stuck to his skin. As he climbed higher, the sound of the rain changed character, shifting from the distant background hum he had heard in his bedroom to a more immediate and percussive sound, a rhythmic drumming that grew louder with every step. At the top of the landing was a heavy trapdoor made of thick planks bound together with iron straps.
He reached up and pushed against the wood, feeling the resistance of gravity and friction before the door gave way, lifting up and falling back with a heavy thud that shook dust from the rafters. He pulled himself up through the opening and stood in the attic, the vast space stretching out before him into the shadows. The attic was a cathedral of timber, the roof sloping down sharply on both sides to meet the floor, creating a triangular tunnel that ran the length of the building. The roof was not insulated here, just bare wooden beams supporting sheets of corrugated tin, and it was on this tin that the rain was playing its nightly symphony. The sound was immense, a roaring static of millions of drops hitting the metal, a chaotic white noise that filled the head and drowned out every other sensation. It was a loud sound, but it was not a harsh sound. It was a texture, a blanket of noise that wrapped around the senses and isolated the mind. The clockmaker stood in the center of the attic, listening. It was raining harder now, a true downpour that hammered against the tin, creating a vibration that he could feel through the soles of his feet. The attic was filled with the cast-offs of the shop's long history, objects that had been moved up here to be forgotten, but never discarded. There were rows of old leather trunks stacked against the chimney breast, their surfaces cracked and dry, looking like the skin of ancient reptiles. The brass buckles on the straps were tarnished to a dull brown, and the leather handles were stiff with age. He walked over to one of the trunks, moving slowly through the sea of dust motes that danced in the faint light coming from a small dormer window. He knelt down on the rough floorboards, ignoring the grit that pressed into his knees, and unbuckled the straps of the top trunk. The leather resisted, stiff and stubborn, but eventually yielded. He lifted the lid, the hinges screaming softly. Inside the trunk was filled with layers of tissue paper that had yellowed and become brittle, crumbling at the touch. Beneath the paper were old clock dials made of painted glass, faces that had been deemed too damaged to use, but too beautiful to throw away. He lifted one up, holding it towards the dim window. It was a moon dial, showing a face of the moon that was smiling, a painted smile that had not seen the light in 50 years. He placed it back gently. Beside the trunks were stacks of old magazines tied together with twine, towers of paper that reached up to the waist. They were trade journals and catalogs from manufacturers that no longer existed, filled with drawings of tools and parts that were now obsolete. The paper smelled of vanilla and mold, a sweet decay that was heavy in the humid air. The rain drummed on, relentless and steady. Thrum, thrum, thrum. It was a hypnotic beat, a rhythm without a melody. The clockmaker walked to the dormer window, which was a small square of glass set into a protruding section of the roof. The glass was old and wavy, full of bubbles and imperfections that distorted the view. He
He wiped a small circle clean with his sleeve, the dust turning to mud on the damp glass. Looking out, he could see the wet slates of the neighboring roofs shining in the dark like the scales of a great black fish. He could see the rain falling in sheets, illuminated by the street lamp below, silver needles stitching the sky to the earth. The gutters were overflowing, the water cascading over the edge in a miniature waterfall that splashed onto the pavement below. He watched the water flow, mesmerized by the motion. It was a chaotic system, yet it had a perfect order, water seeking the lowest point, gravity doing its work. The cold from the glass radiated against his face, a refreshing contrast to the stuffy air of the attic. He turned back to the room. In the corner, under the lowest part of the eave, was an old daybed, a piece of furniture that had been retired from the living quarters years ago. It was covered in a dust sheet that draped over it like a shroud, transforming it into a ghostly shape in the shadows. He walked over to it and pulled back the sheet, revealing the faded floral upholstery underneath. He sat down on the edge of the bed, the springs groaning a familiar welcome. He leaned back against the wall, closing his eyes and letting the sound of the rain wash over him. Here, directly under the roof, the noise was at its loudest, a physical pressure that vibrated in his chest. It was like being inside a drum, a comforting enclosure of sound. He thought about the clocks downstairs, ticking away in the silence, marking time that no one was watching. He thought about the bells in the storeroom, silent and wrapped in paper. He thought about the spider in its web. Everything was waiting. The attic was a place of waiting. The objects here were in a state of suspended animation, caught between use and decay. He felt a kinship with them. He was also waiting, though he didn't know for what. Perhaps just for the next second, the next minute, the next hour. The rain showed no sign of stopping. If anything, it was getting heavier, the drumming on the tin intensifying into a roar. He imagined the water rushing through the downspouts, rushing through the drains, rushing out to the river and down to the sea. It was a continuous cycle, a journey of water that never ended. He felt a heaviness in his eyelids, a desire to just lie down on the dusty daybed and sleep. The sound of the rain was a lullaby, a powerful drug that suppressed thought and invited rest. He lifted his legs onto the bed, not caring about the dust on his shoes. He lay back, looking up at the dark rafters. He could see the faint outline of spider webs in the corners, thick and gray with dust. They looked like lace decorations hung for a party that had happened long ago. He watched a single drop of condensation form on the head of a nail in the beam above him. It grew slowly, gathering moisture from the air, swelling until it was too heavy to hold on. It fell silently, landing somewhere in the shadows. He waited for another drop. It took a long time. Time was slow here. The attic existed in its own time zone, separate from the shop downstairs. Down there, time was measured and sliced into seconds. Up here, time was a pool, deep and stagnant. The smell of the cedar wood from the trunks drifted over to him, a sharp, clean scent that cut through the mustiness. It reminded him of forests, of trees standing in the rain. He imagined the forest floor covered with needles, the silence of the woods, the rain falling on the leaves. Shh, shh. The sound in his head mixed with the sound on the roof. The distinction between the two began to fade. He was drifting, floating on the sound. The roughness of the upholstery against his hand was a grounding sensation, a reminder of the physical world. He ran his fingers over the fabric, tracing the pattern of a flower, a rose perhaps, or a peony. The threads were worn smooth. He wondered who had sat here before him, who had slept here. Maybe his father, maybe his grandfather. The shop had been in the family for generations. They had all climbed these stairs. They had all listened to this rain. They were all part of the house, part of the dust. The thought was not sad, but comforting. He was part of a line, a continuity. He was the current custodian of time. The rain slackened slightly.
the roar diminishing to a steady thrum. The wind picked up, whistling softly through a gap in the eaves, a low, mournful note that harmonized with the rain. Ooh. It sounded like a flute played in a distant room. The clockmaker shifted his weight, finding a more comfortable position on the lumpy mattress. He felt safe here, tucked away under the roof, hidden from the world, protected by the storm. No one could reach him here. No one knew he was here. He was invisible. The feeling of invisibility was liberating. He could just be. He didn't have to be the clockmaker. He didn't have to be anything.
He was just a consciousness listening to water falling on metal. The darkness in the attic seemed to have a texture, a grain like the wood of the beams. He stared into it, seeing shapes that weren't there, patterns of light and shadow that shifted when he moved his eyes. It was the visual equivalent of the white noise of the rain, a blank canvas for the mind. He felt his breathing slow down, becoming deep and rhythmic. Inhale, exhale. The air was dusty, but it tasted of old memories. He remembered playing in this attic as a child, hiding behind the trunks, listening to the rain, just like this. The feeling was exactly the same smell, the same sound, the same safety. Time had moved on, but the attic had stayed the same. It was a capsule of the past. He felt a wave of drowsiness wash over him, a warm tide that started in his feet and moved up his body, relaxing every muscle, every nerve. His hands went limp, his jaw relaxed, his eyes closed. The sound of the rain on the tin roof became the only reality, the only thing that existed. Thrum, thrum, thrum. It was the heartbeat of the house, the heartbeat of the night. He let himself go, let himself drift on the sound. He was floating away, floating up through the roof, floating into the clouds. The rain was all around him, cool and refreshing. He was part of the storm, part of the water. He was falling gently, falling with the rain, falling towards the earth. It was a beautiful feeling, a feeling of total surrender. The clockmaker slept. He slept on the old daybed in the dusty attic, surrounded by the trunks and the magazines and the broken clock faces. He slept while the rain hammered on the roof. He slept while the wind whistled in the eaves. He slept while the clocks downstairs ticked their endless count. He slept deeply and without dreams, held in the arms of the house, held in the arms of the past, held in the arms of the boring, beautiful, endless rain. The descent from the dusty heights of the attic was a slow and careful reversal of the climb, the wooden steps groaning once again under the weight of the return journey. But this time the sound seemed deeper and more resigned, as if the house itself was settling down for the night. Reaching the hallway again felt like entering a different climate zone, the air cooler and cleaner than the trapped heat of the roof space, but still holding the faint domestic warmth of the living quarters. The clockmaker did not stop here, however, for his inspection of the night was not yet complete, and there was one final layer of the building that required his attention, a layer that lay beneath the earth and held the foundations of the silence. The door to the cellar was located under the main staircase, a narrow panel of dark wood that was almost indistinguishable from the wainscoting that lined the corridor. It had no handle, only a small iron keyhole that required a long skeleton key, which the clockmaker kept on a ring in his pocket. The metal of the key was cold against his fingers as he fished it out, the jingle of the keys sounding loud and bright in the quiet hall. He inserted the key into the lock, feeling the tumblers shift with a heavy mechanical clunk before the door swung inward, revealing a set of stone steps that disappeared into a darkness that smelled of wet earth and ancient mortar. He reached inside and pulled a cord that clicked on a single low-wattage bulb, which cast a dim yellow pool of light onto the top steps, leaving the bottom in shadow.
The descent into the basement was a journey into the geological past of the building, the wooden floorboards giving way to rough-hewn stone that had been quarried from the local bedrock a century ago. The air grew colder with every step, a damp chill that seeped through the fabric of his clothes and touched his skin with clammy fingers. The smell here was distinct and heavy, a mixture of mold and wet stone, and the metallic tang of copper pipes, and the faint sulfurous scent of the old coal chute that had been sealed up decades ago. Reaching the bottom of the stairs, he stood on the concrete floor, which was uneven and cracked in places, painted a dark battleship gray that absorbed the light. The basement was a vast, cavernous space that mirrored the footprint of the shop above, but felt entirely different in character. It was low-ceilinged with heavy wooden beams that were darkened by age and soot, supporting the floor above. The silence here was not the dry, dusty silence of the attic, nor the ticking silence of the shop, but a heavy, damp silence that felt pressurized, like the air at the bottom of a deep ocean. The dominant sound was not the rain, although the rain could still be heard as a distant muffled drumming on the ground outside, but rather the internal fluids of the house itself. Along the ceiling ran a network of pipes, copper and iron, wrapped in crumbling insulation, carrying water and heat to the upper floors. One of the pipes had a slow leak, a rhythmic dripping that fell into a plastic bucket that had been placed on the floor to catch it. Drip, plop, drip, plop. The rhythm was incredibly consistent, a water clock measuring out the time in liquid intervals. The clockmaker walked over to the bucket and looked down at the water inside, which rippled with every drop, creating concentric circles that expanded and bounced off the plastic sides. He watched the ripples, hypnotized by the repetitive motion. Drip, plop. The rhythm was slower than a heartbeat, slower than a clock tick, a slow adagio of decay. He looked up at the pipe, examining the joint where the water was escaping, a bead of moisture forming slowly, swelling against gravity until it could hold on no longer, and fell. He wiped the pipe with a rag he kept in his pocket, but the leak was persistent, a reminder of the constant pressure of the water system. He left the bucket where it was, knowing that it would take days to fill at this rate. The basement was used for storage of the heaviest items, the things that could not be carried up the stairs. Against the far wall stood rows of cast-iron weights, the driving force of the largest tower clocks. They were cylindrical and black, some weighing as much as a man, sitting in silent rows like dormant artillery shells. The clockmaker walked past them, feeling the cold radiating from the metal. He touched one, the iron rough and freezing under his hand. These weights held potential energy, just like the springs upstairs, but it was a heavy gravitational energy, a force that pulled downwards towards the center of the earth. In the center of the room stood the old boiler, a massive beast of cast iron and rivets that once heated the entire building with coal, but had since been converted to oil. It sat silent now, its firebox cold, its gauge reading 0. It looked like a sleeping dragon, its metal skin pitted and scarred. The clockmaker checked the pressure valve, tapping the glass face with his fingernail. The needle did not move. It was resting. Beyond the boiler was a workbench that was used for the dirtiest jobs, the cleaning of large gears and the casting of lead weights. The bench was covered in a sheet of zinc that was stained with oil and flux. Tools hung on the wall above it, heavy hammers and large wrenches and ladles from melting lead. The shadows in this part of the room were deep and long, thrown by the single bulb and the shapes of the furnace. The clockmaker sat on a wooden stool by the workbench, the wood hard and unyielding. He leaned his back against the cold stone wall, feeling the chill penetrate his shirt. It was a grounding sensation, a reminder of the solid earth that supported everything above. He closed his eyes and listened to the basement. Drip, plop, drip, plop. The sound echoed slightly in the stone chamber, bouncing off the walls and the floor. He could hear the faint scurrying of a mouse somewhere in the shadows, a tiny scratching sound that stopped as soon as he shifted his weight. He could hear the hum of the electric meter in the corner, a low electrical buzz that was almost below the threshold of hearing.
And deep in the background, he could hear the rain filtering through the soil around the foundation, a soft seeping sound of water moving through dirt. It was a subterranean world, a place of roots and stone and water. He felt very far away from the shop and the street and the attic. He was in the bunker of the house, the safe room. The air here was rich with ions and dampness, a heavy air that made the eyelids droop. He breathed it in deeply, tasting the minerals and the mold. It was not an unpleasant smell. It was the smell of time itself, of things slowly breaking down and returning to the earth. He thought about the foundations of the building, the large stones that had been laid by hand so long ago. They were still there, holding up the walls, holding up the clocks, holding up his life. They were silent and strong. He felt a deep sense of gratitude for the stones. He felt the fatigue of the day settling into his bones, a heaviness that started in his legs and moved up his spine. The cold of the wall numbed his back slightly, a pleasant numbness that relieved the tension in his muscles. He imagined himself as one of the iron weights, heavy and still, waiting to be lifted, waiting to drive the mechanism of the night. The dripping water was a lullaby. Drip, plop, drip, plop. It slowed down his thoughts, washing away the worries, washing away the lists, washing away the names. There was only the drop, the weight, the drop, the weight. It was the most boring sound in the world, and it was perfect. The clockmaker rested his head against the wall, the stone cool against his skull. He let his mind wander through the pipes, following the water as it traveled through the walls, up to the kitchen, up to the bathroom. He imagined the water sitting in the pipes, still and waiting. He imagined the oil in the tank, still and waiting. The whole house was a machine for waiting. He stayed there for a long time. How long he didn't know, because there were no clocks in the basement to tell him. Time here was measured in drops, not seconds. Eventually, the chill began to be too much, so he stood up stiffly, his joints popping in the quiet. He walked back towards the stairs, his shadow stretching out before him, long and distorted on the concrete floor. He paused at the bottom of the steps, looking back into the gloom. The boiler sat silent. The weights sat silent. The bucket caught the drops. Drip, plop. He climbed the stone steps slowly, counting them as he went. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. At the top, he opened a door and stepped back into the hallway. The warmth of the house wrapped around him like a blanket. He locked the cellar door, turning the key until the tumbler clicked. He put the key back in his pocket, the metal now warm from his hand. The contrast between the basement and the hall was jarring for a moment, but his body quickly adjusted. He walked down the corridor towards his bedroom, the floorboards feeling soft and warm after the concrete. He entered his room and sat on the edge of the bed. The rain on the roof was audible again, a steady thrumming that felt light and airy compared to the heavy silence of the basement. He felt completely ready for sleep now. The journey through the house was done. He had visited the heights of the attic and the depths of the cellar. He had inspected the silence in every corner. He lay back on the bed and pulled the covers up. The sheets were still warm from where he had lain before. He closed his eyes, and the images of the night played across his mind. The ticking clocks in the shop, the silent bells in the storeroom, the rain on the tin roof in the attic, the dripping pipe in the basement. They all blended together into a symphony of the house, a boring, beautiful song of safety and rest. The clockmaker drifted.
He drifted on the river of time. He drifted on the river of rain. He drifted into the deep, dark, heavy sleep of the stones and the earth. Sleep, 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 sleep.